So, مساء الخير جميعا. Good afternoon, everyone. So this is the dessert panel that comes right after lunch. I hope everybody's going to be awake. We'll try to make this as crisp as possible and as interactive as possible. So we have a great panel with a great topic. We're discussing today the intersectionalities between climate change and the SDGs. Obviously, with a focus on the global south, we have a very distinguished panel. So I'll introduce from the left. We have Ms. Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, who's the Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs. Her expertise lies in South African foreign policy, Africa and external powers, global governance, and South-to-South cooperation. She's also the Editor-in-Chief of the South African Journal of International Affairs and serves on the UN's second high-level advisory board on economic and social affairs. She's also the co-chair of the task force on SDGs of the Indian think tank 20 Presidency in 2023. We also have my dear friend, Dr. Awny to my left. He's a professor of practice and the director of the Gerhart Center at the AUC. He teaches operation management at the undergrad and the MBA level. And previously, he was the head of the qualifying industrial zones at the Ministry of the Trade and Industry and was the partner in charge of supply chain consulting at KPMG. He's a PhD in operations research from the North Carolina State University. And to my right, I have my last distinguished panelist, Monsieur Nicolas Buchoud. He's the senior advisor to the Dean and CEO of the Asian Development Bank Institute, ADBI. He co-chairs the T20 India Task Force on Life Resilience and Values for Well-being and is the former advisor to the president of Paris Île-de-France region and the deputy chief of staff of a city mayor in the Paris suburban area, and he's an expert on urban finance and infrastructure. So without further ado, the way we're going to do this is I'm going to ask my fellow panelists to start with some opening remarks, and then we're going to take some questions from the floor, and we'll moderate the session, and hopefully we're going to be closing in less than an hour. So Elizabeth, I would love, obviously, the climate crisis is obviously existential. So out of all the SDGs are very important, but climate change obviously is the one that's existential. So if the climate goes wrong, again, I think none of the other SDGs would matter. But at the same time, I think the perspective of the North and the South in the issue of climate, I think also needs addressing. And so obviously being an expert, if you'd like to shed some light there, this would be amazing.
Thank you. In the long term, we're all dead, I suppose. But firstly, let me first congratulate ECES on their 30th anniversary. You're now a full-fledged adult. And taking on all the responsibilities that are associated with that. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's been some time since I was last in Egypt, and it's very good to be back in Cairo. So let me make a couple of observations around development and climate, but also bringing in the G20 here. We heard earlier this morning from Samir Saran about the focus of the Indian G20 presidency being very much on development, recapturing development and putting it at the center of the G20 agenda. Of course, this is not necessarily a new thing. In 2010, just in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, there was a realization that just looking at the financial aspects of managing the global economy was not sufficient, that it was important to bring in a development dimension and to also think about all the other countries that were not part of the G20. And at that time, what was produced was the Seoul Development Consensus. It went through a series of changes, but it kind of lost momentum, a bit like everything else lost momentum. There was an attempt to sort of bring in, and they did, in 2016, the Chinese brought the SDGs into the G20 agenda, reworked the frameworks in the aftermath of the adoption of the SDGs the year before. But I think there has been a sense, certainly from many developing countries, that the focus has been largely around financial issues, and that that other issues are sacrificed on the altar of financial issues. I think with the Indonesian presidency in 2022, now the Indian, and followed by the Brazilian and the South African, there is hope that the momentum that has begun is really going to be built up, and that we're actually going to change the DNA rather than just have a momentary, I'm not a biologist, but whatever it's called, a glitch in the system that then reverts back to what it was. I think moving on to the issue of development and climate, we think about, in the global south, we talk about the importance to develop, to industrialize, et cetera. The critical issue here in the 21st century, in the third decade of the 21st century, is that we actually require a different paradigm of thinking about how we're going to achieve development. In Africa, we've been receiving aid, development cooperation, I don't know, for 60 years, 70 years. It hasn't necessarily made that significant a change in our development context. We're doing it with a particular superstructure in mind that has a set of rules that have been determined externally and which don't work in our circumstances. So we've seen the financialization, I think Samir alluded to that, of globalization. That globalization hasn't delivered, never mind for people in the global south, it also hasn't sometimes delivered for people in the global north, and we've seen growing inequality. And the inequality issue for me, coming from a country like South Africa, where we currently, I think, have the highest Gini coefficient, has to be the single most important challenge when we're dealing with development. And then there is the issue which we've talked about this morning, which is technology and knowledge division and discrimination, access. And I think, why is technology important in this panel? Because those who drive technology are going to be the victors of the next phase. They are the victors of the fourth and the fifth industrial revolution. If we are cut out of that, we continue to then be dragged along rather than also leading. But just one point on technology. I do believe that there is increasing momentum around knowledge production, innovative knowledge production in the global south. We see that in South Africa. I think we see it in other parts of the continent. We see it in Egypt. We see it in India. We of course see it in China, although China is kind of, it's the second largest economy. It's in a different category, I think, from the rest of the global south. But those dealing with inequality, dealing with the technology divide, tackling the sort of global superstructure around globalization are key issues to ensuring development. And that for me is fundamental. It's not about the projects, it's about the paradigm shift. The third point I want to make is the point that development, of course, can't be achieved in a linear way, and it's not achieved in the same way in every country. And I think increasingly when we're talking about achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, we're also recognizing that you may have a particular goal, you may have a particular outcome in mind, but the way in which we go to that outcome is not necessarily going to be the same for every country. My country has a particular issue when it comes to climate change. We use a lot of coal, and we can because we have a lot of coal. Now that's a problem, and I'll come to it. But the way in which we tackle that is probably going to be very different from a country like, for example, Brazil, that doesn't use a lot of coal. Okay, and so we have to recognize that, and that's not always the case. I think it's important to note that there is no trade-off. There shouldn't be a trade-off between climate and the SDGs. But I think the way in which the narrative has been shaped historically is implying that. So this morning, the Assistant Foreign Minister spoke about, the discussion happening around the evolution roadmap of the World Bank, that the World Bank, thinking of the MDBs becoming climate banks. Well, they can't. They can't dispense with their primary mandate of dealing with poverty, addressing poverty. At least the World Bank is talking specifically about the World Bank. And so that's the challenge that I think we face in the debates, in the G20, in the discussions around the international financial institutions, that it is coming across as either or. And in that process, it almost feels as if you're being, the developing world is being asked to curtail their energy consumption in order to be able to achieve the goals. Now, I'm painting that rather, I'm sort of very black and white and monolithic, and it's much more nuanced than that. But just to put it in context, 600 million people in Africa are energy poor. So our energy consumption is going to grow. Hopefully our production can grow as well. And I say that coming from a country that is currently challenged in energy production. But our production, our consumption and our production will grow, both to deal with ordinary citizens, but also to deal with the position of growing economies, of industry, private sector, and so on. And we also have a young population. And I think that itself is critical, needs to be factored in when we talk about development. We cannot stay, many of the countries on the continent can't stay at sort of an average of $2 a day. That's not feasible. It's not feasible from a political stability perspective, or a social stability perspective, and from an ethical perspective, quite frankly. And so the other question is the issue of consumption in the north. When we talk about climate change and SDGs, it's also about recognizing that to tackle climate, we also need to tackle consumption in the north. And I know that the Europeans are doing a lot in that regard, but we also have to make sure that in the process of what the policies that the north is taking to reduce their consumption, it's also, or to make it more green, it's also not disadvantaging us. And I think the CBAM point has been made. The Inflation Reduction Act is another dimension of it. And so that's the kind of environment we're navigating, which certainly feels as if, the responsibility is on us in the developing South, but the superstructure doesn't help us to achieve that. And last but not least, of course, is the global financial architecture and how you access finance for development, for climate, and what the cost of capital is for developing economies. I've probably spoken too much.
Well, that's fantastic, Elizabeth. Thank you very much. I think the great framing, I think, of the issues and the context, I think, of the tension between the development needs of the North and the South, and working together to be able to tackle these challenges in a more holistic and global fashion. Dr. Ali, I'd love for you, if you can give us, I think you have some good framing on the governance issues, I think ecosystem governance issues in terms of dealing with this.
Okay, let me just start one step back. When intersectionality. When you think about intersectionality, it comes across as its interrelatedness, interdependence, which is, this is the first thing when you study systems, this is what they tell you about it. A system has components that are interconnected, interrelated. The climate change is a systemic problem. So it means it cuts across. Very similar to the SDGs. When you look at each one of them, they tend to go together. For example, we cannot reduce poverty without improving health, without improving education, without providing jobs. SDG number 13 is actually about combating climate change. So they get net zero emissions, etc. Now, when I want to talk about climate change, I want to follow the UNFCCC, which is the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change. This is the entity that arranges the COPs. And they deal with it from two perspectives. The first one is adaptation. The damage is done. How do I help people affected by it to cope with it? The other one is mitigation. Mitigation is how do I repair, how do I regenerate. Now, when you think about adaptation is 100%, it impacts people in a very different way. The poor people are more vulnerable to climate change. People who already have food insecurity, hunger, bad health, are more impacted with the adaptation. I'm not going to go through, but you can go through each one of the SDGs and you can see some aspects of adaptation to it. The other one is mitigation. How do I stop it? And I would argue that a green transition is part of it. And that gets you into issues like climate justice. Again, the issue is how do you protect the vulnerable? Because they'll suffer more, whether in how they adapt or in how do they mitigate. The SDGs usually could divide them into, people usually divide them into 3 parts, which is typical. I mean, economics, there are some economics aspects, social and environmental. But then there are like 16 and 17, which tends to be more of governance or how to work together. I mean, you cannot work on all things together unless you cooperate, and you cannot cooperate unless everybody knows exactly the scope of their work and where their job starts and ends. So there are lots of issues of governance. I could tell you one interesting thing. When you look at governance under the SDGs, is underrepresented, full stop. And I could tell you two examples to sort of support this. You can just go and check it. There is a framework that builds on the SDGs. It's called the GAP frame. It's done by one university. One of them is the University of Lausanne. And what they have done, they've actually appended the SDGs with other more SDGs that complements and it adds more to the governance. Think of it. What is poverty about? Let me tell you what governance means so you can understand what I'm talking about. Governance, and I'm using OECD. It's about rule of law. It's about accountability. It's about transparency. It's about responsiveness. It's about inclusiveness. It's about efficiency. And it is participatory. We all participate in it. So when you look at it, you can see right away that, this is how, I mean, why do I have poverty? It is a lack of governance. Why do I have many of the lack of SDGs that you're trying to achieve, you will achieve it actually by achieving governance. So governance is the cause, not the symptom or the effect. Another interesting thing is there is something called the Mo Ibrahim African Governance Index. When you look at it, you're going to find it's exactly SDGs, but he appended it more with governance. I mean, the first time I saw it, it was like SDGs. But then it is very smart because actually they took something which is incomplete and they've added governance to it. If you want to check, I mean, even at the global level, I mean, the Paris Accord, which is one of the first accords to sort of combat climate change, I mean, there was a certain president who actually pulled a whole major country out of it. And then after it came. So it tells you right away there is a lack of governance. I'm not going to get into the recent politics to show you the lack of governance even in the global system. I think some people talked about COP28, for example. Usually in COP28, instead of they focus on fossil fuel, they're going to throw another F word at you. Excuse my English. The other F word is food security. But it's really diversion. I mean, think of it. I mean, the whole region there, this is the first time they made surplus in their budget for the last 5 to 10 years. So if you're going to tell them cut fossil fuel, it's like, take a hike. This is the last wave, and we're going to take it. I want to stress on one thing that she started to talk about. Most of the narrative about sustainability, sustainability, we talk about business case. This is wrong. Even UN speakers, they come and they tell you there is a business case for sustainability. There is a business case for green transition. We have to talk about it from a case of survivability. And again, I'm going to refer to a system science mindset. There's something called tipping point. And we've observed it, by the way, in 2019, 2020. I mean, we were fine, everything was fine, and then we were told there is a pandemic, stay home. Then no planes. No movement, nothing. And then everything was put to halt. This is exactly an example of a collapse. So an issue of survivability should actually override when somebody tell you business case. This is much more important. I just want to talk about one thing and then I conclude. Lots of people now think in terms of SDGs, and I want you to think about the same when you talk about climate change. They think about SDGs from an ethical point of view, code of ethics, moral. So you cannot say, for example, yeah, I steal, but I give money to the poor. You cannot say, I sell tobacco, which would ruin health of people, but then I will but then I will take care of the gender. I provide gender. So ethics is integral. You can do no harm. That's the minimum. If you want to do good in one aspect or the other, fine, go ahead. The other thing is human rights. If you think at every one of the SDGs, just bring the UN Charter of Human Rights, put it next to the SDGs, and I'm sure you're going to find lots of matches. And again, when you talk about human rights, it's integral. The purpose of all what you're doing in the end is the well-being of human beings, which is a human right. I'm going to conclude at this. Thank you.
Super, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ali. I think fantastic points again, this idea about adaptation versus mitigation. I think the angle of seeing things through systems, again, and understanding that systems need to balance out, and hence the governance importance in balancing out systems, and the idea about survivability versus short-term viabilities, the idea about thinking short-term business cases versus tackling issues that obviously are in a different horizon and that are existential in nature. I think very, very, very interesting points. Nicolas, I think you have also a very interesting take that you can land us now on the ground in terms of think tanks, what we can do, what we should be doing, again, and really sort of bring this conversation, ground it, and take us towards more action-oriented ideas.
Thank you so much, Chair. And while I think Elizabeth, and this morning it was widely celebrated the 30th anniversary of ECES, I was thinking that similarly, the Asian Development Bank Institute in Tokyo was established 26 years ago. Last year there was a book for the 25th anniversary, and the think tank precisely is based in Japan, but it's not a Japanese organization, it's a multilateral organization. It chaired the group of think tanks of the G20 during the G20 Japan back in 2019. And this year we chaired the group of think tanks of the group of the G7. And interestingly, the ADBI was created just in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis as a kind of response about why on earth all the most brilliant minds who have been educated in the best universities in Europe, including at that time the UK, or in the US, in the Ivy League, have not seen the collapse of the currencies across Asia coming up, right? Why there was such blindness about the conditions, the prevailing socio-economic conditions, and some elements of monetary policies inadequacies. So the thinking was not anti, but let's create a new generation of experts and expertise so that maybe this will contribute to anticipate better on future crises. This was a little bit the rationale behind the creation of the Asian Development Bank Institute. And I think this is a nice illustration of how much think tanks should not avoid the state of crisis, but should embrace crisis. So whenever I would say we hear we are in a fragmented environment, there are divides and so on, for me, maybe over-optimistically, I always look at it as I would not say as a treasure, but as an opportunity to build bridges instead of just commenting on symptoms of a crisis, to go beyond our zones of comfort. And I think whenever I can look back, it was always a question about being challenged, being compelled to find other solutions, and certainly not to say this is the original sets of values, everything that diverges from the norm should be sort of avoided, we need to stick back to those values. It's quite the opposite. Last year, in 2022, we edited a book that was called A World in Crisis, A World in Progress, Growing Better Together. And that was an assessment of a decade of the work of the G20, the group of think tanks in the G20, that was initiated in 2012, in spring 2012, during the Mexican G20 presidency. A number of prominent thinkers from prominent think tanks decided that enough is enough. Governments were not doing serious job and serious stuff. They needed to give them more serious advice, and they wrote a policy note about what governments should do. This is a little bit how, for the anecdote, how the T20 was initially very incrementally organized. And what is interesting is that without any mandate, right? Without any mandate, and over the years, and Antonio Villafranca is here, and he was playing more than a pivotal role during the T20, G20 Italy not long ago, could comment on that more, even better than I would. The group of think tanks was consolidated. Task forces were created to address a variety of topics. And of course, not all of the policy proposals were neither interesting nor relevant sometimes, but something emerged, which I think corresponds exactly to what we need when we need to address very complex sets of issues about how to move across SDGs that are not going well and climate issues which are terrible. That is, for think tanks from very different regions and very different affiliations, and the global north and the global south and western and non-western, to know each other, to understand also each and every one's backgrounds, but also to learn to talk to each other. So this year, during the G20 India and the G7 Japan, we we pushed or decided to embrace even more, in an even more structured manner, that way to bridge what we call bridging G7 and G20, which might look a little bit paradoxical because G7 countries are all members of the G20, so what should we bridge? But of course, since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine and other elements of geopolitical transformations, it is obvious that it is not superficial. It is not, I would say, superfluous to do that bridging. And we really worked hard not to focus on on the points of disagreements, but how can there be issues to agree upon. And precisely, the questions of how to support or reignite the Agenda 2030 emerged very strongly. But not just that. Not just that. And I would say without this approach, our colleagues from India especially, we gathered the current, past, next presidencies of the T20, of the T7, plus the Sherpas of the G20 and G7, plus I would say, the equivalent in the Sherpa track, in the finance track, right? And something that is quite obvious emerged is that the framework of the SDGs has been largely established without sufficient regard to the organization of the global macroeconomic system, not to mention the global financial architecture. And at this moment, thinking about the finance gaps which are plaguing the SDGs without thinking how to transform the global financial architecture or how to address profound macroeconomic imbalances, especially the fact that well over 50 lower and middle-income countries in the world, especially in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, are facing completely unsustainable debt levels, right? Just exposes discourses about the SDGs to sort of turn around and around and around without any possibility to find solutions. So once there has been an agreement, and we met and we met and we met again and again in the past few months, at the occasion of the SDGs summit in the sides of the UN General Assembly, we met again, we issued a note, we made some proposals. Some of them were channeled to the conclusions of the T20 and somehow also to the G20 India. And luckily, the G20 India presidency also understood that there needed to be a new effort stemming from the G20 to reignite the 2030 agenda, hence the release of a new sets of high-level principles and so on. What I would like to mention also in that context is that sometimes think tanks are considered by others, or sometimes also by themselves. They do analysis, right? They share analysis with each other, sometimes with governments. But think tanks are also solutions brokers. They are not just observers of symptoms. They can do more. And in the context, for example, of the African Union becoming a new full member of the G20, the space for cooperation and the demand for cooperation is immense. And then, of course, there are all the possible hurdles you can imagine about trade and monetary policies and cross-border payments and etc. But if think tanks, and again, there will not be anyone asking think tanks to do that, right? If think tanks together, based upon the experience gathered and the workforce and the habitus gained by cooperating years after years in a very, I would say, artisanal or incremental manner in this space of the G20, do not decide to collaborate with each other, to go with the emerging groups or networks of think tanks in Africa, and Elizabeth would know that far better than I, we will be missing an opportunity. So you were asking about ways to take action, etc. I would say now the Indian are handing over the G20 presidency to Brazil. And Brazil looks a little bit far away, right, from the shores of Egypt, even further from the shores of India. And then it will be South Africa. And then Italy will be chairing the G7, and so on and so on. But there are lessons learned from cooperating. First, cooperating in face of the pandemic crisis, right? During the G20 Saudi Arabia, I don't want to be too long, but suddenly in March, we were all stranded. And the brilliant minds of the think tanks, right, however brilliant they were, I would say maybe 1% of them who would have seen this crisis coming up as it did. And so even the think tank said, we cannot move, etc., but managed as others, as governments, etc., to move online in just a couple of weeks, and then it all restarted. So that's also another example, a very interesting example of resilience. And I would say that this dialogue among think tanks is a way to provoke resilience, to build resilience, not to be passive in times of rising fragmentations or even fractures. And one of the opportunities we have, probably globally, is that in the next 24 months, we need to make a strong case with the African Union becoming a new member of the G20 and work hand in hand with small, government-connected, less government-connected, civil society-based, more research-oriented think tanks or the likes organizations across the African continent, not just with a purely, I would say, African perspective, but in a global perspective. And that's a task that will be extremely demanding, and that demands, I would say, even more cooperation and kinds of ways to be open-minded for such cooperation than we have been used to do. The last point I would like to mention, when I asked in Sonobe about whether he wanted to pass any message, was yes. First, to do that, we need to make sure that more think tanks from especially the United States and China also continue to sit together, and this is not always the case. And second, that also think tanks sometimes should take more seriously their ability to play also a connecting role with research not done by them, but done by scientific organizations and the so-called science to society interface. Think tanks have a responsibility to foster that instead of being one more series of organization commenting on technological transformations, artificial intelligence and the likes, but sharing an understanding of what does it mean. Is that how deep this is a change in the economy and how to build on that. Our colleagues from India, will finish with that, have launched, and I was in Delhi for that just 2 days ago, a new initiative called Global Alliance for Life Economy Research and Innovation, which is exactly tied with the high-level principles issued by the G20 India to revive the SDGs with a strong, I would say, global south emphasis. And this is yet another opportunity for think tanks, including ECES, including for organizations which are in the room to join in and continue join forces and build bridges exactly at the same time where there are another series of diverging forces which are at play.
So Nicolas, again, a fantastic intervention. Thank you. If I try to take the key themes, for me, I think this idea about focusing on think tanks as being conduits. So again, connecting, I think, with each other globally and filling the gap where sometimes government cooperation can fall short. Think tanks can fill that gap. Also being a conduit with the broader community, the broader scientific community, the broader academic community, not only to be closed on themselves. Again, thinking global connectivity, not only regional connectivity. Through that connectivity or through that bridge, what I understand from you is this would allow global think tanks to be able, number one, to have greater predictive power so they can see global issues better, so they would not miss the next COVID or not miss the next Asian financial crisis or the next big crisis that's going to come along. Second thing, it enables them to create equitable and feasible solutions that take into account different interests of different players, whether they are within regional structures or they are between global south and north. But also this allows them to become agents of real change. So again, having a bias for action actually will take them from just, again, being solution brokers, your word, into actually real agents of change. And I think there's a very specific recommendation that obviously US and China today being the biggest global powers today, they need to be much more involved in that global dialogue, that global think tank dialogue. So they need to actually be, they have a responsibility to actually be at the forefront of this integration of the think tank community and the think tank community, again, with the broader ecosystem. So again, phenomenal insights. Thank you, very, very educational. Thank you very much. So at this point, I'd love to open it up for questions or comments, and then we're going to take a round of closing questions. Please, Antonio.
Thank you very much. When talking about climate change and SDGs, of course, there is one big issue to be solved, which is money, where money comes from. And so far, the debate has been on who runs the responsibility for this. And there's no doubt that the north of the world runs the biggest responsibility for the part of CO2 which is already, for instance, in the atmosphere. But we know that if we really want to succeed in fighting climate change, we need the engagement also of the South, starting from China. Otherwise, whatever the effort made by the North and whatever the responsibility, there will not be an effective solution to climate change. But let's skip for 1 second the issue of responsibilities, which is in the way I just said. The point is where money is coming from for mitigation and especially for adaptation. We know that there is this commitment made by advanced countries to give $100 billion per year. They've been given only partially, unfair, they've been given only partially. There is the loss and damage fund discussed in the COP, which is an empty box so far. Nobody knows what is going to be financed, and nobody knows who's giving the money to that. And this is, for me, the challenge for the think tanks. My feeling is that in concrete terms, I don't see any further possibility for the North to further provide public money for this, because they have budget constraints, because they have huge public debt, and because, most of them are democracies. And whatever the government, if they have to choose, to give this money abroad, so to say, and cut welfare state, I don't think that there is a selling point for any government from extreme right to the extreme left. So the real challenge for think tanks is to see how to better build a public-private partnership, how to really support access of developing countries to financial markets, how to really change multilateral institutions in order for them to provide collateral, to provide guarantees, the risking for investments in green transition, especially in poor and developing countries. And this is, from this is my point of view, also a responsibility for the think tank community to make concrete proposals on how to make it happen. Because if we simply focus on the clear-cut responsibilities and on public money, I don't think that there will be a real, concrete, pragmatic answer to the issue of global climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. What I'm going to do is I'll take all the questions and then I'll ask our panel to reply in their closing comments. تفضل حضرتك.
في 2023
حضرتك تعرفنا بنفسك بعد إذنك.
انا اسمي محمد منصور، باحث قانون في وزاره الماليه.
أهلا وسهلا.
في 2023 دول بريكس مجتمعه اللي هي تمثل اكبر دول العالم مساحه وعدد في السكان، تخطت الناتج المحلي الاجمالي بتاعها دول جي 7 اللي هي تعتبر من اكثر الدول تقدما واكثر الدول تمسك بالراسماليه. التمسك بالموفمنت دي بيخلينا نركز على حركات التحرر الاقتصادي والسياسي في المنطقه زي منطقه افريقيا، وان في بعض الدول وبعض القيادات في الدول الافريقيه بقى لها صوت بتنادي بالتحرر بحقوق الدول دي، خاصه بعد في مواجهه بعض الدول اللي هي مستعمراها زي فرنسا مثلا اللي هو استعمار اقتصادي، وثروات الدول دي لدى الدول زي فرنسا وغيرها من الدول. فاذا كان في سبورت لحركات التحرر دي، بيتهيألي ان هنقدر نوجد حاله من التمويل لعمليه مقاومه التغير المناخي وتحقيق اهداف التنميه المستدامه.
So I'll quickly, I'll recap. Any other questions or comments?
Thank you very much. That was a very rich panel, and I really appreciate all the interventions. And our moderator is playing a really great role, summarizing and capsulizing and everything else. Now, the elephant in the room, I think Antonio has just picked on it, which is rather than using the word governance, using the word politics. You correctly pointed out all the good features of a good governance sort of thing. But there is one thing to describe what are the features of a good governance globally or locally or whichever, in this particular case, we are talking globally. And the other one is politics, self-interest. I mean, I think what is missing in the discussion is the word self-interest and versus public interest, if you like. And the tension between both is not that obvious. And not focusing too much on the good governance and ignoring the self-interest in international politics is missing the point. So I would like you individually to comment on that, politics rather than governance. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. Any other questions or comments? So I think this is perfect, so we can take time for wrap-up. So let me recap the questions very quickly. So we have the question from Antonio, I think, is around where does the money come from? So despite the global north or the more developed countries committing more than $100 billion, again, not all per year, not all have been deployed. The loss and damage fund that's been created, that right now is still an empty box, obviously hasn't been clearly funding. And constraints on further commitments from the north due to high levels of debt, high budget deficits, and obviously the nature of the governance systems in these countries, obviously, which would put constraints in terms of at the expense of priorities. So big question is, where would the money come from in order to enable particularly countries in emerging countries and developing markets to be able to do these green transitions? So what the ideas would be. Then our friend Mohammed was asking again about how developing countries, so the BRICS now have become, their economies are growing, and I think he's shedding specific light on the economic liberalization of the economic independence in Africa, post-imperial economic independence, and the idea, his question is, should, again, the global think tank community support more independence or economic independence in Africa that would actually unlock more economic development. And then Dr. Ahmed Galal, obviously the very sharp shaping of the two issues of politics versus governance, and the angle of self-interest versus public interest, because obviously without understanding these tensions, I think the solution space would be incomplete. So Elizabeth, we'll give you the fortunate chance to take a stab at these.
Yes. So Antonio's point is absolutely correct. I mean, without private money, we're not going to be able to reach from billions to trillions that we need, both for climate and for more broadly the SDGs. Absolutely. I think, but it's not an either or. I think there are things we can do with public money, including MDBs, that can actually increase their leverage power. So a lot of the ideas on the table regarding multilateral development banks, or indeed even the IMF and the SDRs, are things that actually should be moving forward. But again, there's the issue of politics, so the SDR reallocation is sort of stuck. I mean, we were talking about this earlier this morning offline here, you know, of the 650 billion issuance, it was 34 billion went to Africa. That's what Africa gets in terms of the quota. But, you know, let's think of creative ways of utilizing the other, whatever, 620 or 616, whatever it is. That my maths was not good. That was issued and that people are not using. And there are ideas on the table, and there are some bottlenecks. Some of them are regulatory, but you know, rules were made by people. We can change the regulations. Some of them, I mean, on reallocation, it requires, I think, 5 countries to sign up to the reallocation. That's the one idea. Another one, in terms of you know, money that goes into paying the cost of capital issues, is around IMF surcharges, which are what developing countries pay every time they borrow money from the IMF, which is great. It helps to fund the IMF. So you know, we get the money, we're given the loans, and we fund the IMF. Basically, the ones who need the money the most. So there are some, but again, that's also difficult and it's political and whatever, and I'm going to come to that question. I mean, another idea on the table relates also to scaling up the MDB so that they can leverage more effectively. And one of the issues I put on the table, which is apparently politically incorrect to do so, is the fact that, you know, the New Development Bank has a AA credit rating. AA+ credit rating. The other banks have a AAA credit rating, and the shareholders want to keep it at that. Understandably, but is, you know, what you're able to leverage, I think, in terms of loans is, you know, by sort of a reduction in your favorability in the market, perhaps is going to be greater even if you go down to a AA credit rating. AA+ credit rating. So that's, I mean, that's another idea on the table. The other issue is then, if I just move very quickly to the private sector, I think one of the challenges that we face, certainly on the continent, is the ability to develop big enough projects, initiatives that can attract capital in a way that, so there's sufficient project preparation, although we shouldn't just be thinking about them in sort of small localized projects. And I think there's probably some work that can go into providing assistance in that area, both in terms of capacity as well as in terms of agreements, contracts and that kind of thing that can really scale up. I mean, for example, I mean, Africa has a lot of, in the PIDA, the Program for Infrastructure Development, you know, there are ideas on the table, there are projects on the table. Not all of them are easily fundable because there hasn't been sufficient de-risking, for example, and some of them battle because of cross-border regulatory issues. Some of these can be addressed, but we need sort of to really build the capacity to have the support to do so. I think, and this goes back to, this answers the question about politics and versus governance. I think what we lack fundamentally in a lot of these conversations is trust. Trust has been lost. And so when Europe proposes something, we look at it and we say, oh, there's something else there. Okay. And then that something else is the CBAM. Okay, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which expects us to transition in 3 years, which is a challenge. So I think building up trust and reducing the perception, the reality of double standards. I mean, it's come up in the Ukraine issue, it's come up in the Gaza issue, it's come up in the climate and the SDG dimension. Let me then just very briefly talk about politics rather than governance. I think that is indeed the big stumbling block. I think trust is an important dimension of that. We've lost that trust. We've lost the ability to actually dialogue. I mean, the point that Nicolas was saying, to dialogue in a way that is constructive and tries to build consensus and coalitions, rather than sitting in a room and saying, this is my position, and this is your position, and the twain shall never meet. And that has to be incremental, and it has to be organic. It's not going to happen overnight. That's the problem with that. And it also has to deal with the fact that you've got societies that feel that the best way they will deal with their challenges is by turning inward or by closing off and closing out. And that, I think, takes time. But I wouldn't sacrifice governance. Governance is important. You need those systems and the frameworks. But yes, they can't work, absolutely, without the politics.
Absolutely. Thank you, Elizabeth. I think key takeaways, I think, from this is private funding is essential. Obviously, public funding is fantastic, but MDBs, I think, can play an extended role. Maybe there obviously politics of MDBs would get in the way. Example, the SDR issue that we're familiar with, but there still is balance. There is enough funding in there, but maybe needs some changes of regulations. Again, if there's the will.
We do need the private sector.
100%. 100%. So we need the public sector, we need the public funds, we need the private sector, we need it all, right? But there is room for resources to be unlocked out of MDBs. Again, things around the structures of funding in the IMF, again, the surcharges and all that. So who's funding who? And again, looking at credit ratings, the politics around credit ratings of new banks versus obviously older banks, and scaling MDB funding. The idea about supporting in creating a pipeline of mega projects, again, packaging the mega projects, making them more investable, again, framing around private partnerships, so creating a pipeline of that. And then I think the last bit is on building trust again, so global politics, bridging the trust gap, because again, we see some flagrant global double standards in addressing some of the global issues, and that obviously doesn't help. Dr. Ali.
Okay.
Take, please.
Well, there are two hard questions, but let me tell you, our center is about philanthropy. Usually when you talk about philanthropy, you talk about deep pockets. But I'll tell you statistics. Deep pockets contributes only to 30% of the pie for philanthropy. The remaining is actually you, I, and others. People in WITS, for example, they call it the poor man's philanthropy. So you're trying, in a way, the reason we went to the 20-30%, that it's easier to study. It's structured. It's the way there is. The remaining 70% is very unstructured, and it's very hard to study. And it needs a little bit more of a platform for giving. How do you, because it's not about one person with deep pockets who's going to give. You're talking about, instead of this guy, there are millions of them. So there is an issue of how do you mobilize, how do you focus? And that requires platforms that doesn't exist. That gets you back actually to the governance issue. Anyway, we're not. So again, when you talk about economics in general, there is a formal, there is an informal. In Egypt, there is a big part which is informal. In most developing countries, the informal sector is huge. It could go up to 40, 50, 60% sometimes. Some people actually attribute the reason in Egypt that we were able to survive the revolution and to survive some of the COVID effects is because of the informal sector. What I'm trying to say here, let me say just one comment and then I'll get to my point. When you look at the global economic system, We, all of us, developing countries, export commodities, period. No value added whatsoever. The value is extracted in the West. And the reason is multitude. They control the traffic, so the prices of commodities, tea, gold, whatever, is not determined by me, the producer. It's determined by the guy who buys it. And those are all colonial relics. Now, the other thing that is again with this also is that they have brand names. So in Egypt, for example, I'm a major producer of many things. I'd have to export it because if it gets into a brand name, it can sell. So what is the solution? You'll have to shake the whole economic system. Is that easy? No, of course not. It's hell hard. It's very hard. I'm talking about even the financial systems. You'll have to create parallel systems that enables you to mitigate or to go around the current existing system. I'm talking about a major disruption, by the way. And by the way, this is exactly what the Chinese are trying to do. The Chinese are trying to replicate a parallel system that replicates the Britain manners and the whole system that the West has put. So what is the solution is to try to democratize, to try to use local resources, to try to sort of export things that we could sort of do it south to south, not south to north. And we try to sort of get, when you talk about technology transfer, hell, it's not going to happen. It doesn't happen. I mean, the Chinese, when they get the technologies, they actually stole it. They actually stole it. They stole it. I mean, people would produce at China. Most of the Chinese products are copies from Western products. By the way, the US did the same to the UK. This is not like, this is sometimes the only way to get things. Now, let me move on. He left, but governance for me, the intention of governments is to guard against opportunism, is to guard against self-interest. That's the only way. Now, is there 100% proof governance? Hell no. Even in the West, nowadays, when you look across, you're going to find there is a rise of populism. This is actually indication of a failure of governance. Again, when you deal with human beings, they're very hard creatures to sort of understand, control, put guards. They're very smart. So if you put things, they move around it. So if you tell me what is the difference between governance and politics, I think the intention of governance is to guard against opportunism, is to guard against politics. Is that given? No, I think it's very hard. But that's the only way. That's the only way we could do it. I think that's there are lots of ideas also about democratizing, even in science, by the way. I mean, there is a new trend on something called community science. Usually, when you measure what you want to show. If you want to democratize, you mean you bring it to the community level. The community is actually measuring the pollution level. Then I have my own narrative. That's the idea. Power is knowledge. Power is I own the system. Power is I can set the prices. And we don't have the power. So anyway, I did not answer directly, but I hope I managed to sort of at least tell you it will require a huge disruption.
100%. So Dr. Ali, thank you. I think very thought-provoking. Again, I think you took us into another dimension, which is, again, this idea about grassroots, so grassroots funding, so unlocking the power of the many. So again, how can we create a cause that the many would actually, which are the ultimate beneficiaries, the population of the planet, right? How can we actually get them to engage, right? The requisite platforms for that to happen, the requisite governance systems for that to happen. I think I love that. I think the other idea around democratization in general. So again, how do we get a new paradigm, a new economic development paradigm where the South and the North are more partners rather than, again, sort of the traditional route of raw materials moving upwards and finished product moving downwards, right? Which is much more of a utilitarian relationship. How do we get a actually integrated development? Codependence, greater codependence versus that the utilitarian relationship that they have. And again, I think you referred to the Chinese model, which I think many of us would agree is still yet to be evaluated over the longer term. But I think there's definitely something interesting happening there. Nicolas, we have 5 minutes on our panel. I'll give you 4 and I'll take 1 to wrap up.
Thank you very much. First, I would say we are all playing with phenomenal forces at play, right? In this context, think tanks are tiny vehicles, right? In larger orbits. If they don't start by creating that trust, and creating trust is a political choice across the G20, G7, G77, BRICS Plus, and the likes. If dialogue doesn't start there, it is most likely that it will not exist very much elsewhere. That is the first point. The second point, G20. If you look at how Indonesia has chaired the G20, how India has chaired the G20, how Brazil envisions its G20, probably in a number of Western countries, maybe even China, have underestimated what it represents in terms of mobilizing the society way deeper than a number of working groups, and certainly much deeper than a leaders' summit. In India, for example, dozens of thousands of students have been involved into a university connect and so on. If you had been to Indonesia, you could see G20 all over the archipelago. And not just for the sake of political communication, but it means something that Indonesia or India, etc., are taking the reins of the most important global macroeconomic forum. If think tanks do not build on such opportunities to enlarge the space for cooperation, to find out, for example, how to de-risk investments in the global south, which is a typical sentence. We could discuss for hours how there were initiatives taken during the G20 Italy, because Italy was also co-chairing COP26, and how such issues were transformed into the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, including a number of very concrete outputs, with Indonesia ahead of the learning curve. And I remember exchanges with the Indonesian Minister of Finance and the South African Minister of Finance at the beginning of the G20 Indonesia in springtime, and how much things had changed 6 months afterwards, just before the G20 Leaders Summit, and how the very Minister of Economy of South Africa said, oh yes, we will envision our strategy very differently now that we have learned from Indonesia, who was smart enough to use the G20 context fully to browse all the possibilities of blended public, private finance, and so on. Then I was very, very optimistic, and then suddenly last summer, for other reasons, part of what private funding or funding from developed country would not come in. So it is very clear that there is a fragile balance between those I mentioned, crisis and progress, and it is not either or. I think think tanks, I will finish by that, think tanks have a responsibility not to repeat slogans and mottos of the day, etc., but to investigate all possibilities to promote a more, I would say, reinforce balance instead of just going into one direction or another, and then to choose between one solution and another solution. I think this is very important, and there is a space for that. And again, when thinking about Agenda 2030 and African Agenda 2063, for example, there are untapped resources of progress for the dialogue, like when suddenly we discovered that there were untapped reservoirs of oil in the soil, there are untapped reservoirs of capabilities and capacities which should be used. And that is, I would say, a very optimistic message at the end.
Amazing. Nicolas, thank you so much. I think the big theme here is around creating trust, and it is a political choice. So I think, and back to, I think, the point that Dr. Ahmed was making, I think you gave the amazing example of how Indonesia, India, and Brazil, they use the G20 to actually rally the communities, the local communities, rally the people around this. And again, so I think out of our whole conversation, I think one of my big reflections or takeaways is how can actually the think tank community globally stop talking to the elites, right? Stop talking to the governments, start talking to and start messaging the global populations, right? So because again, the greatest lever, I think, against any political system are the populations of these countries, right? So if we can actually make knowledge accessible, if we can actually create an alternative vision, if we can actually create the platforms to be able to mobilize not only voices, but also mobilize funds, mobilize a lot of these things. And I think we saw this very clearly in the Ukraine and in the Gaza crisis, how global public opinion really actually is sort of shaping the political course, despite what some political leaders in some countries actually would want. And so at this point, I think just to respect the time of the panel and the time of everybody else, thank you very much for your attention. I know this is one of the toughest panels to have after lunch, but you guys have been an amazing audience. Thank you very much.